All right, so good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We've got folks joining us from coast to coast across Canada and the US, and that is particularly suitable because we are live in our Oceans Week Canada extravaganza. For those who don't know, June 8th is World Oceans Day, and it is metamorphosed, expanded, gone crazy into a full week of amazing programs around the globe. And that exploring by the seat of your pants, it is always our biggest and most signature week as the school year winds to a close. So thank you so much to all our amazing teachers and educators around the world for joining us as we continue to showcase and celebrate such amazing people and places around the globe. So Oceans Week Canada, that's your one-stop shop site below. Of course, you can check us out at our general site here. And if you want to see our partnership programs with the Explorers Club, check out our Ocean Week series as well. There's just all the URLs, really. We're trying to confuse and annoy you guys. I hope we're succeeding in a little bit in the best way. Now, today we are bringing back one of my very favorite speakers on this broadcast, and that is Dr. William Halliday. So he is joining us live in British Columbia today. One day before heading off for a lovely vacation, we got to switch the schedule around, got him in a little early just for you guys. So today he is going to talk about songs of the Arctic Ocean. He gets to go up to one of the most remote and amazing places in the world in his role as a scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada to go listen in to marine mammals, whales, seals, and more up in the Beaufort Sea, one of the most special and unique places on this planet. So it's always one of my favorite programs. I hope it is for you guys as well. Welcome in, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Halliday.
Hey, Jesse, great to be here.
Nice to see you, man. Well, I can't wait to dive in, and we got a whole bunch of folks joining on YouTube live with us, and let's get to it.
All right, perfect. All right, takes like 3 clicks to get there, but here we are. So good morning, everyone. And today I'm here to talk to you about marine mammals in the Arctic and what I do to study them and what we can do to help them as they're facing climate change. So just in case you don't know what these particular animals are up on the screen, up on the left, we have a bearded seal that I just saw last month, poking his head up above the water and keeping an eye on me. And then on the right, we have a whole bunch of beluga whales, and we're going to learn a bit more about those today. Okay, so before we get into the cool animals, who am I? Why am I here speaking to you? So I started off my career as a wildlife biologist or ecologist, studying lemmings of all things. I actually started my research work in the Arctic. And so this is on the left is a picture of me in my first field excursion on Herschel Island up in the Beaufort Sea in the Yukon, where I studied small mammals, lemmings, and other things. I then moved over and did a PhD studying snakes and beetles and how they select habitat. And then finally, I made it full circle back to the Arctic. And here's a photo of me now from some of my current work. Where have I worked? Just to give you a nice map of North America here. So all the red stars are different places across the country that I've worked in my various research. And the yellow stars are the places that I've lived doing that research as well. And so I've done work all across southern Canada, in northwestern Ontario and in northern and eastern Ontario, and now where I am over on the west coast of Canada. And then my recent research is all up with these red stars up in the Arctic, so pretty far north. So what are the species that I'm studying? What are these spectacular marine mammals that live in the Arctic? So first off, we have the bowhead whale. They're a very famous whale because they are the oldest living mammal, living up to at least 200 years old. They also are pretty spectacular, large, one of the largest whales, not the largest. They're not like a blue whale, but they are very big. We then have beluga whales, who are very well known. They're sometimes called the canaries of the sea because they make so many cool sounds, and I'm going to play some sounds for you later on. Also narwhal, the unicorn of the sea, also only found in the Arctic. Some of the seals that I've spent a lot of time studying lately, the bearded seal and the ring seal. So these two guys are Arctic specialists. They know how to live on sea ice all year round. And so what makes these Arctic animals special? Well, I just gave it away a little bit, and it's sea ice and it's cold. And these are the things that these animals are really good at dealing with. So all of these animals, they're good at dealing with the cold. And to do that, they all have thick blubber. So they have a thick layer of fat underneath their skin that keeps them warm. And by thick, I mean like for a bowhead whale, it's really thick. And for the seals and the beluga and narwhal, it's, you know, it's still a pretty thick layer of fat. If we look at our skin, you know, we've got skin on muscle. There's not really any blubber there to keep us warm. We have to dress up in warm coats and hats and mitts to deal with the cold, but not these Arctic marine mammals. They also have some very special ways of dealing with sea ice. So the whales, you'll notice something about Arctic whales. They don't have a big fin on their back. That's called their dorsal fin. So belugas, I'm just going to hover my mouse over the screen. You can see just this tiny little, they've darkened it a bit, this dark fin right there. Compare that to what you might have seen with a killer whale, where they have this big fin across their back. Arctic whales don't have that, and that's so that they can swim underneath the sea ice and not get caught on the sea ice. All of these species of whales have thick skulls. Bowheads have a very thick skull. They can break through sea ice that's 2 feet thick, so that's about 60 centimeters thick with their skull. I certainly can't do that with my skull. Beluga and narwhal can break through about 10 centimeters with their skulls. So they've got these thickened skulls to help them get through the ice. And the reason they do that is because they actually have to get to the surface to breathe. So if the Arctic is fully frozen over in the wintertime, they need to find holes in the ice to breathe. And sometimes they make those holes with their heads. Finally, the seals. The seals have large claws on their front flippers, and that's so that they can dig through the ice and snow, and similarly to find places to breathe, but also to build out some really cool dens underneath the snow on top of the ice. So ice is not only something that they have to deal with in order to get up to the surface and breathe, and it's something that's helping keep the Arctic cold, but it's also something that they use in their day-to-day life. So the seals use ice for hauling out on. So they actually get their bodies up on the ice and they just stay out there and they bask in the sun and they socialize together up on the ice. They use it for mating and giving birth to their young and raising their young. Whales tend to use ice for predator defense. If there's a bunch of killer whales that come up to the Arctic whales like bowhead, narwhal, and beluga, they all go into the ice so that the killer whales can't follow them, because killer whales with their big dorsal fin don't work very well in the ice. All of the fish-eating species, they hunt near the ice, they live near the ice, because the fish that they like to eat, Arctic cod, are specialized on ice. So they tend to follow that ice around to get their favorite food. So all this to say, sea ice is super important to Arctic marine mammals. And here's just some photos from my recent trip, just showing you what those seals are doing out on the ice. So these ones are all, you can't see it very well in this photo, but there's a crack running through the ice. And these seals are just grouped up around that crack. So they're socializing, they're out in the sun, getting warm. And then here's what they do with their claws. Here's a photo of one of their breathing holes or haul out holes. And they literally, as the ice forms in the winter, they scratch it open. And then every day, probably multiple times a day, they're in there with their claws, scratching around and just keeping it open, because otherwise it would freeze over every day. And so they maintain this hole as the ice grows. That ice is 2 meters thick, and that seal has managed to maintain that hole all winter long. And if you look really closely at the photo, you can actually see the scratch marks from their claws on the ice. So it's pretty cool. Now, why are we worried about this? Why do I keep talking about sea ice? Well, climate change is causing pretty big changes to the Arctic. It's causing losses of sea ice. And so I'm just going to play a video for you. And this is made by NASA. And I'm going to mute the video so you don't have to listen to the person talking and you can listen to me instead. So every year, the Arctic goes through this freeze-thaw cycle. So on this map, you're seeing the older ice, this white ice in the middle. And then every winter, it expands out to cover the entire Arctic, and then every summer it contracts in just to the middle of the Arctic. And so if you track this through time, it's been, it used to, that white sea ice in the middle used to cover a very, very large area in the middle of the Arctic. And as years went by, it shrinks and shrinks and gets smaller and smaller. And so I'm just gonna move forward a bit in the video. This one's now letting us watch it through time. And so you can see the date and the months go by. And there we are in the 1990s, and there's still a lot of ice. And if we skip ahead forward again to the 2000s, even to the mid 2000s, there's still a decent amount of ice happening. But now, pretty much from this period going forward, 2008 was a record low year. There's less and less of that ice in the middle. And as I think this video goes up to the mid 2010s, like 2015 or so, and we're going to see less and less of that ice, and there's just it is disappearing from the Arctic. And other scientists, ice scientists, they project that by the year 2050, During the summertime, there's going to be no ice left in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And that's during the summertime anyways. In the winter, it's still going to freeze out and cover areas, but it's changing, and it's changing very quickly. And so that represents a pretty important issue for the animals that live there, that are that use sea ice for their habitat and have adapted to living within sea ice. So what does sea ice loss mean for these Arctic marine mammals? One thing is a shifting timing of migration. So the whales, for example, bowhead and beluga, they where I study them in the Western Canadian Arctic, they come up and they spend time in the Western Canadian Arctic in the summer as the ice starts to break up. And then they leave the Western Canadian Arctic and they travel into Alaska and down to the Bering Sea. And they do that in the fall as the ice starts to form. So if the ice starts to break up earlier and form later, it means we've got a longer summer season. And so the whales may start migrating earlier in the spring and migrating back to Alaska later in the fall. We may be seeing a shift in migration timing. Also shifting habitat use. As there's less and less ice in the summertime, the whales are having to go further and further offshore into the middle of the Arctic Ocean to find that ice that they like. We're seeing a shift in the prey species that are moving up into the Arctic. There are different zooplankton species that bowheads are foraging on, and there are different fish species that are moving up that beluga are foraging on. They're having competition with southern species. We're seeing more large whales come up that didn't used to live in the Arctic, like gray whales expanding further into the Arctic, humpback whales and minke whales coming up, and these are all eating the same food that bowhead whales are eating. Over in Nunavut, they recently saw sperm whales very far north, and sperm whales are eating, again, some similar foods to narwhal and beluga over there. So they're getting new competitors coming up. Predators are coming up more. I mentioned killer whales earlier. Well, killer whales are becoming more and more common in waters in Nunavut, for example. And so there's more predator pressure on those whales over there. And finally, and this is the area that I study a lot, we're getting more disturbance from human activities. More ship traffic is coming through. So what do? I just mentioned that I study ship traffic. What I do, the main thing I do is I do underwater listening. So I put hydrophones in the water. These are underwater microphones. I leave them in the ocean for a year at a time often, and I'm listening for the sounds made by marine mammals, as well as fish, and I'm also listening to the sounds made by ships. So I'm just going to quickly go through and play some sounds for you here, and hopefully they're loud enough for you. Here's a bearded seal.
That's perfect, Bill. Fantastic.
So bearded seals are super cool. That sound is called their trill call, and I cut it off really early. That call can last for over 60 seconds, over a minute. They hold this whistle, and it goes from high down to low, and even back up high again afterwards. It's super cool. And during the breeding season, it's sometimes the only sound you can hear underwater because there are so many of them making that sound. Next up, we have the ring seal. These guys always make me smile. So those are their barks and yelps. They make some other sounds too, but this is kind of the most common sound that they make. Kind of sounds like it may be a dog, like, and then marked with they do it intermittently with a yelp. It's pretty fun to listen to. Like I said, it makes me smile every time. Here we have the bowhead whales. Here's our big whale species. Okay, so bowhead whales, they make really low moan sounds, but then they also sing. They are one of only 2 whale species who are known to sing. And by sing, I mean they they actually make songs. They have different notes that they pair together and repeat, and then they change the songs throughout the year. Bowheads have been called the jazz artists of the underwater world because they're constantly riffing on their songs. They're constantly changing the notes that they're singing. So it's pretty cool. The other species that sings are humpback whales, and you might have heard about humpback whales singing. Next up, we have belugas, the canaries of the sea, like I mentioned earlier. So belugas are called the canaries of the sea because they make just so many different types of calls. They whistle and they click and they do those raspy calls that we were just listening to, but then just a bazillion different types of whistles. Not a real number, but you get the idea. So many different whistles that they make. And they're very cool, especially when there's lots of them together in a pod, like in this picture. They would be just chatting constantly, and you'd hear so much variation. And then finally, the other thing that I listen to, which is a bit annoying to listen to, is a ship. And here's what a ship sounds like. And as the ship gets closer and closer, you hear it louder and louder and louder. And the thing about a ship is yes, it sounds annoying to our ears, but imagine that you're a whale underwater and you had no way of getting away from that sound. And you could no longer even hear yourself making sounds, let alone hear your neighbor making sounds. And so underwater noise is a pretty important issue for many of these species. So where I work, I mentioned earlier, is the Western Canadian Arctic. So here's a picture of the top of Canada. We have the Yukon Territory and the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And most of my work is right up here in the Eastern Beaufort Sea and Amundsen Gulf. I do also work in Nunavut a bit as well. So the species that I work with, the seals, for example, they tend to kind of go all throughout the area. They don't seem to have a very strong migration, unlike the whales, because they're able to just settle somewhere in the winter and make their own holes to the surface to breathe. The whales, on the other hand, are migratory. So they come down from the Bering Sea up to the Western Canadian Arctic to feed in the summertime, and then back down to the Bering Sea in the wintertime, because they go down to below, south of where the ice edge is, so that they can get to the surface and breathe all winter long. So just to look at what we've been doing, so this is a zoomed in map of the study area where I work, and all of these points represent where we've had hydrophones underwater. We've been studying the underwater world since 2014 up in this area. And so starting up at Sax Harbor at the south end of Banks Island, and then this blue star over at Ulahaktuk on Victoria Island was our next study site. And then more recently, we've been expanding down here into along the mainland coast, so in the Amundsen Gulf and over into the Beaufort Sea. And so we've got, at this point, I have 11 recorders in the water right now that I have to go up and retrieve this summer, or have my colleagues help retrieve this summer. So we have lots on the go, lots of really cool underwater recordings coming back every year. And here's what some of that equipment looks like and some of the field work looks like. So just the top left, that's me setting up all of these recorders, these big yellow tubes in the lab. Here's one on the top right that came out of the ocean. So this is the black on the top. That's the actual hydrophone itself. So that's the bit that measures sounds, and you can see a bunch of gunk on it from being in the ocean for a year, a bunch of zooplankton and phytoplankton stuck to the side of it, algae growing on it. Here we are out in a zodiac, out surrounded by sea ice, having just recovered one of these recorders. Here's that same recorder, just covered in kelp and other things coming up from the bottom. You can imagine if you're on the bottom of the ocean for a year, there's a lot of stuff that sticks to you. We take these big planes and we land on beaches, and then we inflate our zodiac and get out in the water and get the gear. And then we also work off of big ships. Here's one of our moorings that we deploy from the big ships with 300 pounds of anchor weight on the bottom, and then these 4 big floats on the top that keep it vertical in the water. And these yellow things are releases that let it go to the surface after the year that we're done. And then here's one of our hydrophones in the middle, and another scientific instrument with it as well. And then most recently, I was just up for 2 trips up in the Arctic this year. One in April, it was minus 25 degrees Celsius. This is me on the top left. We just finished drilling a hole through the ice, through 2 meters of ice, and dropping a mooring through the water. Yes, that is all sorts of stuff stuck to my mustache because it was that cold. Every time you breathe, water condenses on you, and then it forms fun little walrus icicles like that, which are not fun to get off of a mustache, let me tell you. And then on my most recent trip up with these folks up near Ulahaktuk, we were out at the ring seal breathing holes, listening to seals and doing a bunch of measurements. And here's us taking some measurements of the ocean. So what have we found so far? Here's one of very few scientific plots I'm going to show you, but this one's pretty simple. We've got the date of the year, so that's July 2017 through March of 2018. These are data that we collected near Ulahaktuk. And then the size of the bar just represents how many calls from these different species we're hearing. So we've got bowheads as these black stripy bars and belugas as these white bars. And I'm just going to talk to you about these two first. So we heard bowheads throughout July and August and a little bit in September. And then we heard some bowheads over in November, but then nothing else. So the bowheads and belugas we hear very much in the summer and early into the fall, and then they're gone in the winter, and that's because of their migration. The seals, on the other hand, the gray stripy bars and then the gray bar. So we heard a few ring seals in the summer, but we didn't hear any others until November, December, January, March, February, and March. All of those months, we heard both seal species, and we heard them quite a lot. And then finally, like I said, we're also hearing fish, these black bars, and we're hearing fish in almost every month of the year as well. And then I've just showed it here on this gray line is the annual sea ice cycle. So the whales are around when there's no sea ice, and the seals are making lots of vocalizations when there's lots of sea ice. But then what's important here, bringing it back to ship noise, is when the whales are there, that's also when the ships are there. And that's when the ships are there making noise. So in the months of July through September, that's our main shipping season up in this area. And so here are all of the ship detections that I found within those months. And this is, shown on a daily scale now. And we see a big peak in large ships that came through near the end of August. So that was a couple of cruise ships, and then some ships that came through to resupply the community. And they're overlapping with those whales when they're nearby. We're also seeing some new patterns. This was a cool study that we just had last year, where we had 4 recorders out in the water for the years 2018 to 2019. And we found bowhead whales on all 4 recorders in the middle of the winter. So this was the first time this has ever been shown, with bowhead whales staying over winter in the eastern Beaufort Sea, so in the western Canadian Arctic. And we think that one reason it might have been happening is because there was really low sea ice that winter. There were lots of cracks, so whales were able to stay around in areas they don't normally stay around in and get to the surface to breathe. The other thing that we're doing is we're trying to figure out how underwater noise from ships is impacting these species. So here's a couple of results from beluga whales. So here on this map on the bottom left, that's a recording site at the Mackenzie River estuary, so near the community of Tuktoyaktuk. The black star is our acoustic recorder, and all of the red lines are ship tracks that came by. And then in this plot, we show that when a ship comes within 5 kilometers of the recorder, we start hearing way less belugas than before or after, which suggests that the belugas are either being quiet, they stop vocalizing, or they actually just leave the area. And it seems very likely that they're just leaving the area when a ship comes by. We also saw this with satellite tracked whales. So this is the speed that belugas are swimming versus how close it is to the ship. And as the beluga is closer and closer to ships, they start swimming faster and faster. And that's likely a flee response. They're actually avoiding the ships. They're trying to get away from the ships. And so we're trying to build up evidence for how these whales and seals, we're starting a brand new project on ring seals now, how these animals are reacting to this all of this noise from ships. We've also done some studies looking at how ships and whales are overlapping. So on the left here, we've got the areas used by whales as these big colored polygons up on the map. And then all of the black lines are where all the ships go. So we see different areas that overlap with the ships. And then on the right here, this is a different way to show it. The bright colors represent hot spots for overlaps between ships and whales. And so we see kind of the main shipping corridor that follows the coastline. There's lots and lots of bright colors, especially near a couple of communities where ships spend a lot of time coming in and out of. And so what does all this mean? Well, Arctic marine mammals live in a place that's changing very quickly. They're seeing loss of habitat with the sea ice, changes in sea ice, and they're seeing increased disturbance from ships. So how will these marine mammals respond? What's going to happen to them in the future? And that's the whole point of my research program, is trying to figure out what are the impacts, where are the whales going to go, where are the seals going to go, and how can we help conserve them in the future? How can we help make their lives better effectively? And so with that, a big thank you, and I'm going to leave you with one final picture of a seal here from my last trip. Just hanging out on the ice, getting warm on a fairly cold, frosty day.
What a fantastic shot, Bill. What a cool program. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And again, as always, when you come on the broadcast, you cover so much in such a short period of time. It just whips by. And so let's dive in with questions. As you said, we've got 2 live classes with us, Ms. Danoa, Ms. Vivas' class. If you guys want to share live, just turn on your mic, turn on your cameras. I'll come to you soon. YouTube viewers, if you guys want to type in the chat, please do. We'd love to take as many questions as possible for the next 15 minutes. But I want to dive in with a question that I always like to ask when it comes to things like this. Why, if you're in Saskatchewan or if you're in Iowa, we have classes joining from all over the world today, does it matter if there's impacts to whales up in the northern reaches of our planet? Like, why should we care, so to speak? I think we both know why we should care, but for everyone else.
Yep, great question, Jesse. And I think that we should care about all species everywhere. And so it just so happens that I study species in the Arctic, but I hope that you can hear some of my enthusiasm about the species that I study, and that that'll make you a bit more excited about the species that live a bit closer to home for you. Um, Also, these species are very culturally important, and that's another thing is there are indigenous people who live in the Arctic, the Inuit, who still rely on subsistence hunting and fishing to get by. Groceries are incredibly expensive, and so they still follow a fairly traditional lifestyle of going out and hunting and fishing to put food on their tables. And some of these species are part of that traditional lifestyle, and so that's a whole other reason, more of a cultural reason, that we should care about them.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that this has become such a sort of a standard thing to highlight in programs with conservationists that work in the north is how integral the communities are up there and this like thousands and thousands of years of tradition associated with these animals. We think about moose or a deer and we go, okay, that's nice. It's something that I see sometimes when I go to a park. And for communities up there, it's an essential part of their livelihood. We had a talk about caribou the other day here. We've had talks about whale hunting and seal subsistence hunting. And I think it's really important that we highlight that. And you guys do a really great job of that at the Wildlife Conservation Society. So thank you for that. I guess I'm curious to follow up on that. When you go up to these places, how entrenched are you with the community? Do you have to ask permission to get out in the water, the land? Do you partner with indigenous researchers or elders to help do the research that you're doing, or how does it work?
Yeah, it's super entwined effectively. So we, on a regulatory side, we have to get full permission. We have to go through a lot of hoops to even get permission to do our work. Way more than people who work, say, down in Victoria have to do. But then once we're actually there, like so my last trip, for example, it was all with people in the community. So we stayed in the community. I was with two guys from the community every single day while we were out there. I had a meeting with the Hunter and Trapper Committee where we talked about our work, and I got suggestions from them and heard any concerns that they had, and we try to address all of that. And then we've got a new project starting this summer where we're actually going to be catching ring seals and putting telemetry tags on them, satellite tags on their backs.
Cool.
And so, talking to people about, like, all right, some of the people in the community have actually done this before. So
Yeah.
talking to them about, all right, where did you do it? How did it work? Would you like to do it again with us? Can you give us some of your knowledge for it? And so it was just incredibly helpful. And without having those connections with people in the community, the work
Yep.
just didn't, like, apart from the permits,
Yeah.
I know nothing about being out on the ice. I know nothing about the local locations. And so getting that information from people and just partnering with them is such a key part of our research.
One of my favorite books ever is Dead Reckoning. Ken McGugan did it talking about all the Arctic days of exploration when the European explorers would come by. And basically, to a story, like if you chart the stories of who succeeded, who failed, all the people that came and worked with Indigenous communities and said, hey, we know nothing about anything up here because we're coming from England. And how can we help get it on the ice? They all succeeded and helped chart the land in a positive way. And people who didn't do that had very shall we say, unsuccessful journeys in the north. So a bit of a darker version of that, but I think it's very important all the emphasis on this that you guys have. And so, what's the goal of putting the telemetry tags on the seals? Like, are you tracking where they migrate to? Do they stay in the area? How they're impacted? Like, what are you looking for specifically?
Both of those things, actually. So one is just tracking where they're going. It's been about a decade since the last study, and there weren't too many seals tagged at that time. So seeing if they're going to the same places or new places, seeing what habitats they're using, since sea ice is so different now than it was even just a decade ago. But
Yeah.
then the big part of our project is shipping impacts. So we're putting on some really high resolution tags on them. One of them is it's got a hydrophone and a camera on it, in fact, and we've got an underwater speaker that's going to play some ship noise to them, and we're going to see what they do.
Cool.
So there's that one, but then the other one, we're tracking them for long periods, like 8 months. Another
Yeah.
one is tracks them for 2 years, and we want to see how many ships they come into contact with, and even
Interesting.
what the reactions are to real ships.
This is such cool research. I mean, this is my professional detachment's out the window here. It's very exciting. I hope you get the best results of that. I'm so looking forward to sharing those stories with our kids.
Yep,
Um,
absolutely.
so we got some questions from Mr. Noam's class. They're a virtual school, so they're just sharing in the chat. How
I
many
see them.
species of seal are there?
Uh, whew, where I study them in the Arctic, we'll start small. there are two species that are there commonly. So that's the ringed seal and the bearded seal.
Yeah.
Let's move out to the whole Western Arctic. So once you include Alaska, we've then got spotted seals and ribbon seals as well. If we move out and we include Nunavut, we then have harbor seals and harp seals and hooded seals. And if you come very far over into like England, we get gray seals. We could keep going. There's a lot of seals. I'm gonna stop there. But yes, two that I study anyways.
Okay. Now I know there's more questions in the chat, but I'll sort of intersperse those. We've got Miss Beavis's class joining us and Peter Burrows. So welcome in 2-3s. If you guys have one for us, come on in. Hey guys.
Hi there.
Hi.
Why are beluga whales so scared of ships?
Great question. It's still a bit of an unknown. One thought is that they live in a very, very quiet environment, and they're so vocal and they're so social with one another. It's such a key part of how they keep in contact with one another. And so they just don't seem to like any loud noises. One idea is that they hear it and they think it's a predator coming through, and so they get scared of it and they go away. But the other is just as simple as they really like talking to each other and they don't like getting disturbed. But we need to do a lot more research to figure out exactly why.
Absolutely. I love highlighting the belugas too for our students' sake. Now, you get to go to these really remote places. Most people will not ever have the opportunity to go to some of the places you do, but you can literally get on a plane in a major city in Canada and head to Churchill, Manitoba and see belugas. You can fly over and see the belugas filling the water. You can go out on a boat and see that as just a regular tourist, bit of an expensive tourist, but it's just one of the most special things I've ever had the chance to do. I know everyone who we've brought on the broadcast that has had the chance to see belugas in the wild. It's such a special experience, and so I'm really glad we get beluga questions. All right, speaking of belugas and small whales and relatives, again, Mr. Knob's class, do you ever hear narwhals?
So no, but that's because where I do my research, we're outside of the range for narwhals. So narwhals live mostly over in Nunavut, especially over in eastern Nunavut, closer to Baffin Bay, and as well as in kind of northern Hudson Bay. But they don't tend to come over to where I study much. That being said, one of the men that I worked with last month, he is convinced that they saw a narluga last summer, and a narluga is a cross between a beluga and a narwhal, and he's absolutely convinced that it is one. And they move around enough that it's entirely possible that there was a daddy narwhal and a mommy beluga, and there's now a narluga swimming around. But I don't know what a narluga would sound like, but
or the superpowers it might possess. We don't know, but that's
exactly
for speculation for next time. Actually, a quick note on that. We're going to go back to Ms. Beavis's in a second. Now, you have a lot of research questions you're trying to answer in the sites that you've gone to so far. Is there any urge to go to Eastern Nunavut, study other species, or are you completely content with doing the stuff you're doing right now? Because there's a lot to answer.
Yeah, there's a lot to answer, and most of my focus is on my study region, but we definitely have been expanding slowly without me having to do too much of the work myself. But we have a postdoc in my group, a researcher in my group. She's going to be in Igloolik, Nunavut this summer, studying bowhead whales. And we did put an acoustic recorder in the water at Igloolik last year. So I'm hopeful that it might have some narwhal sounds on it if we're lucky. And then we've also got another project that we're kind of taking part in Baffin Bay this year. So again, more chances to get some narwhal sounds down the road. So we're slowly going all over the place.
The Arctic's a very big place. There's a lot of places to explore, a lot of inlets up there.
Oh yes.
Awesome, Miss Beavis's class, come on back in if you got a second one. Hey guys.
I have a question. What are belugas' normal lifespan?
Ooh, that's a good one, and I don't have a good answer for you on that one. My best guess is more than 20 years, but it is definitely a guess.
I got it. I looked it up. This is where Google comes in handy. I like the questions about like lifespan and all these like little things that apply. At least 25 years old and may live up to be 50 for narwhals. In the wild, we know that definitely. Sorry, was it narwhals or belugas?
No, it's a beluga question.
Oh, it's beluga. See, I'm typing in the wrong thing, but this is where things come in handy. So
it's going to be similar.
Yeah, 35 to 50, very similar. That's how you get those narlugas possibly. It's a similar lifespan. So this is actually, I think there's a really important note, because I think as a student, certainly when I was the age of our students in classes, my assumption was that, all those facts, how big, how long, how old, you would know that just completely instinctually, and you'd know that for every single creature up there. And I guess that's more of a actually something you'd see in indigenous communities that are harvesting or using or around the animals, rather than the more detailed scientific questions that you're asking. So I mean, what you know a lot about little parts of things, but not necessarily everything about the whole ecosystem. How to describe this to kids? Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so I study, I study their conservation, I study their vocalizations, but I don't study their physiology. I don't study their lifespans. I have some colleagues that do. I was
Yeah.
on a study where we were studying ring seals, and one of the things that we did was aged them. So these were ring seals that were part of one of the hunts in the communities. So when they sampled them, they also grabbed a tooth, and with their tooth, you're able to count the number of growth layers and figure out how old it is. So, you know, I've been attached to some of these studies, and I've certainly read things like, bowhead whales are, can go up to 200 years old, because that's just a fun fact. But yeah, there's a lot of details about these animals that I don't study, so they aren't right on the forefront of my brain.
Yeah, perfect. I always like when we get to explain that to kids. I think it's a really important point. So many great questions from Mr. Nom's class. So this is a complicated one. We talked about acoustic threats to some of these species. How many seals die from pollution or climate change a year? Can you explain a little bit about how we know that or not know that for our kids?
Yeah, the short answer is we don't know that. We don't have a good idea, and that's mainly because seals. So let's just focus on ring seals for now. Ring seals are a super abundant Arctic species. There's thought to be more than 2 million of them around the entire Arctic. And then where we study them are just these little pinpoints, areas around communities. And so we hear from people at communities who are there about, if they see a seal or not, and how many seals are they seeing? Are there more or are there less? Sometimes people might actually tell you about how many dead seals they find, but not very likely, in fact, just given how common these seals are in the area. Now, over in Alaska right now, with different seal species, so more southern species like spotted seals, and I think it was mostly spotted seals actually, they have what's called they've had an unusual mortality event where a lot of seals were washing up on shore dead.
Huh.
And so NOAA, that's the organization in the US, they are tracking that. They officially called it an unusual mortality event, and they're trying to figure out what might have caused it. And from what I understand, it's still a bit of an unknown, but certainly no direct link to whether it be climate or pollution for those cases. And the sort of pollution that I study, the noise pollution, usually doesn't cause death outright. It's more of a long-term thing where it makes it so that the animal has trouble foraging at one time, so it might be a little bit less healthy over the long term, but it's not like it suddenly hears a ship and dies.
Right.
There are some noise sources that do cause that, like some deep diving whales. They'll hear sonar from a Navy ship, and they'll immediately surface, or they'll immediately dive to try to get away from it. And when they do that, they get decompression sickness, or the bends, something that happens to divers.
Yeah.
And then they get found on beach with a bunch of disrupted organs on the inside because they dove too quickly. And so that's a case where noise can be like the direct link to the death of an animal.
Yeah.
But we haven't seen that in Arctic species yet.
Interesting. And I hope we don't. I mean, this is what some of the research since you're tracking is going to help understand. But the Arctic has opened up to a lot more shipping. So we're really keen to know as much as possible how it's impacting ecosystems, how we can avoid that sort of impact. And I think it's so important to highlight that. And again, our classes can check out more of your work online. They can check it out on the Wildlife Conservation Society website and more if they're excited. Bill, time flies and you're having fun. We've got time for 2 more questions before we wrap up. So Miss Beavis's class, come on in for one last one. Hey, guys.
Have you ever got bit by a snake?
Any snake bites in the Arctic?
Oh, bringing it back to my PhD research even. Yes, I've been bitten by many, many snakes, but they've all been non-venomous species like garter snakes and northern water snakes. So, they get defensive, and if you aren't careful when you're going to pick them up, they'll grab onto you. So I've had lots of blood on my hands while I do snake research. I've never even held a venomous species though, so nothing dangerous. Just that's part of the job. I've also been bit by many lemmings and voles and mice and things like that too. Never by a marine mammal though. I'm hopeful that I'm never going to get bit by a marine mammal.
See, our unexpected Shakespearean line of the day is, I've had a lot of blood on my hands. So thank you for that in our broadcast. It's always nice when we get things like that. All right, one last question from Mr. Nom's class online. Okay, and we're gonna extend this from seals to all marine mammals. What seal or marine mammal is your favorite and why? No pressure at all.
It's hard to pick. Like I said, ring seals are a bit of a favorite, and it doesn't help that I was just out studying them right now. They're pretty cute and cuddly looking. They also have a lot of attitude. So when I hear them doing their barks and yelps, it sounds like they're being a bit sassy. And we were driving up to some on our last trip, and they're sitting at their haul-out holes or along these cracks in the ice, and they're just watching you, and they're waiting to see if you're going to come up and be an issue for them or not. So a lot of them are skittish, and they'll drop in the water while you're still pretty far away. But some of them, they're there, they look at you, they look down at their hole, they look back up. It's like they're glaring at you. It's like they're, just like, what are you doing? Do I have to get in this hole right now? And then they eventually, when you get too close, they go in. And it's, just they're so fun to watch. And I look forward to going up and seeing them more every research trip. So I think they're my favorite right now.
Dr. Halliday, I must say the pantomime of what the seals actually do and look like and their audio thing earlier makes my day. So thank you very much for sharing that and being willing to do that in our program. I want to note, if people do want to check out WCS website, there's all sorts of amazing stuff there. We can get that link to all our interesting classes. And of course, this is part of our Ocean Week Canada series. So our website we already shared, but oceanweekcan.ca, over 100 events, 2 amazing resource hubs for kids. If you guys want to learn more about the ocean, keep that learning going and get inspired and excited by the stuff that Bill does and so many other amazing scientists across Canada and beyond. Do check that out. It's a really great one-stop shop for all of that. And Bill, as you know, what we do to wrap up every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our teacher friend. So Mr. Nom, if you want to appear on screen or unmute your mic, you can. Miss Beavis's class, join me in saying a big thank you and farewell as we wrap up today. Welcome in Ottawa and Peterborough. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye, guys. Bye, Miss Beavis's class.